A woman went for a peaceful hike one morning and never came home. For 7 long years, her family searched, hoped, and feared the worst until a hiker stumbled across something deep in the forest that changed everything. What happened to her out there? And what did she leave behind that no one expected? This is a true-to-life tale of mystery, loss, and the quiet power of love that endures beyond time. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? We'd love to hear from you, so scroll down and say hello. Now, let's begin. Asterisk on an October morning wrapped in golden silence. The sun rose gently over the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long shadows across the treetops. The air was cool and clean, laced with the scent of pine and the rustle of early fall leaves. Emily Lawson stepped onto her porch in Roanoke, Virginia, tightening the straps of her hiking boots and adjusting the small day pack on her shoulders. She was 36, a quiet woman with warm brown eyes and a mind that often wandered deeper than most people could see. A middle school teacher by trade, an artist at heart, Emily loved the woods not for the adventure, but for the stillness. They offered a place where time slowed and thoughts could breathe. That morning, she told her husband Daniel she just needed a few hours to herself, maybe to walk the Flat Rock Hollow Trail like she had dozens of times before. Daniel kissed her cheek as she left, not knowing it would be the last time he'd see her. Emily drove out early, reaching the trailhead just as the light began to spill over the ridge. She parked neatly near the edge, locked her car, and slipped into the trees. Her backpack held only the basics: water, a granola bar, her small leather journal, and the silver bracelet Daniel had given her on their 10th anniversary, a delicate chain with a charm shaped like a leaf, one like a heart, and one a tiny open book. She wore it every day, always on the same wrist dot. As the morning wore on, the forest swallowed the sound of her footsteps. No one saw her on the trail. No cameras captured her movement. She simply vanished. When evening came and Emily hadn't returned, Daniel didn't panic at first. She often lingered in nature, sometimes finding a quiet spot to sketch or write in her journal. But by 9 o'clock, the house was too quiet. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Daniel began calling her friends, then her sister, then the sheriff's office. By midnight, the search had begun. The deputies reached the trailhead first. Emily's car was still there, locked. Inside sat her wallet, her reading glasses, and a thermos of coffee that was still faintly warm. But there was no sign of struggle, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate where she had gone. The woods were vast, but it was as if she had simply melted into the air. By dawn, dozens of volunteers had gathered. Some were locals, who knew the mountain like their backyard. Others were strangers who had heard about Emily's disappearance on the news. Dogs sniffed along the brush. Helicopters scanned from above. Every inch of the trail was walked and rewalked. Her photograph, a smiling portrait taken on a family trip to Maine, was everywhere, pinned to tree trunks, taped inside gas stations, printed in newspapers. Daniel stood at the edge of the search zone each day, calling her name until his voice gave out. He hadn't slept, couldn't eat. His world had tilted on its axis and refused to right itself, but days became weeks. The leaves turned and began to fall in earnest, blanketing the trails and burying any signs she might have left behind. The initial shock faded, replaced with quiet unease. People stopped showing up in such numbers. News crews left. The sheriff's office ran down every lead. None of them led anywhere. A hiker claimed to have seen a woman that morning near Devil's Elbow, a narrow part of the trail with a steep drop, but the area had already been combed over and nothing had turned up. Another said he'd heard cries in the distance, but couldn't be sure. Some whispered that Emily had fallen and no one would ever find her. Others suspected something darker, an encounter gone wrong, someone hiding in the woods. and a few crueler voices suggested she had chosen to disappear. Daniel refused to accept that. Emily wouldn't run. She wouldn't leave without a word. They had no fights, no secrets between them. She had been quiet lately, yes, pensive. There were things she was sorting out inside herself, but nothing to make her walk away from the life they'd built. He remembered every conversation they'd had in the weeks before. Nothing had felt final. Nothing had hinted at goodbye. As November rolled in and the mountains grew colder, the official search was scaled back. Deputies still patrolled the area, but the urgency had faded. To the world, Emily Lawson became another name on a list. But to Daniel, she was still his wife, still alive somewhere, lost, hurt, waiting. He kept everything exactly as she left it. Her slippers by the bed, her coat on the peg by the door. He couldn't bring himself to touch her things. Every day, he passed her favorite mug in the kitchen cupboard, the one with the faded bluebird on it. Every Sunday, he refilled the bird feeder outside her studio window. He would sit for hours on the porch just staring down the road, half hoping he'd hear footsteps or see her figure walking out from the woods. That familiar smile blooming like it always had. The calendar turned, one day at a time. Thanksgiving came without her, then Christmas, then the New Year. Daniel marked each date with quiet ritual, his grief carved deep but private. And though the world moved forward, neighbors stopped asking. Her school hired a new teacher. Her friends sent fewer messages. He stayed rooted in that morning, in that moment when she said she'd be back before dinner. She never came back. The trail was quiet once more. The forest, unchanged, kept its secret. And somewhere out there, beneath the canopy of rustling leaves and shadows, was the woman he loved and the silver bracelet she never took off. The days that followed Emily's disappearance unfolded like pages in a dream that refused to end. Morning light would creep across the foothills, and with it came fresh hope. But by nightfall, that hope would fade once again into unanswered questions. For the first few weeks, the community of Roanoke and the surrounding towns stood still, suspended in worry and effort, united by the desperate urgency to find her. Search parties grew each day: firefighters, forest rangers, church, volunteers, teachers from her school, even old students who remembered her lessons and gentle smile. Everyone wanted to help. The mountains echoed with voices calling her name, and search dogs barked into the stillness, noses pressed to the earth, trailing whatever faint scent remained. Helicopters thundered above the tree canopy, sending flocks of birds scattering into the sky. It was as if nature itself had been disturbed by her absence, but it offered no clues in return. Daniel refused to leave the trailhead. He set up a small folding chair near her car and waited, as though she might walk out of the woods at any moment. He spoke to every ranger, studied every map, questioned every detail. He hiked into the woods alongside the others, even when his legs trembled from exhaustion. They found pieces of litter, animal tracks, and boot prints that led nowhere, but never anything that truly pointed to Emily. Not a piece of fabric, not a single belonging. It was as if she'd been erased from the trail altogether. The sheriff's department remained diligent in the beginning. They marked zones, created grids, logged coordinates, and coordinated shifts with military precision. Local radio stations gave daily updates, and regional news channels interviewed Daniel on camera. He stood with sunken eyes and an unshaved face, clutching one of Emily's scarves in his hand. "She's out there," he said, voice raw. "Just need someone to see her. Please." That footage was aired statewide, touching hearts and stirring others to join the effort. For a time, it felt like the entire state was searching for Emily Lawson, but nature is vast and attention is fickle. After 2 weeks, the number of volunteers began to shrink. Some had jobs to return to, others had families needing them. The dogs grew tired. Helicopter fuel ran low. And still, not a single sign of her was found. The trail wound on for miles in every direction. The woods became a maze, thick with underbrush, hidden ravines, and old logging roads that weren't on any maps. Hope was still present, but thinner now, stretched and fragile. Each passing day carved deeper lines into Daniel's face. Inside the sheriff's department, other voices began to speak more freely. What if she wasn't on the trail anymore? What if she had left voluntarily? The questions filtered into Daniel's ears like poison. Had she seemed distant? Was their marriage truly solid? Could she have been planning something, anything that might suggest she didn't want to be found? Daniel pushed back hard. Emily wouldn't do that, he repeated like a prayer. He brought out old letters, anniversary cards, photos of them laughing on camping trips, evidence of a quiet, enduring love. But the absence of physical proof of her presence in the forest made the alternatives harder to ignore. As the days slid into weeks, and then into a full month, the official search was scaled down. The command center was packed away, the big white search maps rolled up, and the trailhead cleared of tents and cones. Deputies still patrolled occasionally, and signs with Emily's face still fluttered in the wind, but the sense of urgency had dulled. Daniel refused to accept the shift. He began organizing his own small search groups, composed of old friends and volunteers who still believed there was something left to find. They combed ravines, marked trees, crawled through caves, and crossed creek beds. It became routine Friday, night planning, Saturday searching, Sunday returning home empty-handed and emotionally hollow. Winter arrived early that year. The first frost came in mid-November, silencing the underbrush and coating every branch in white. The search grew colder, harder. The forest no longer felt inviting. It was harsh, unforgiving, a place of endings. Still, Daniel came. He always came. His hands cracked from cold. His breath hung heavy in the air. But his will did not falter. He kept journals filled with notes, places searched, strange noises heard, markings on trees, tracks that vanished. He documented everything. If Emily was out there, he would not let her be forgotten. Back in town, life crept forward. The school hired a substitute for her class. Neighbors stopped by less. At the grocery store, people whispered softly as he passed, unsure of what to say. Some avoided eye contact. Others tried to console him with empty words. "Maybe she's in a better place," someone once said at the post office, and Daniel merely broke down then and there. He didn't want her in a better place. He wanted her here at their kitchen table, barefoot in the garden, humming while she made tea. And through it all, he thought of the bracelet. That delicate silver chain she wore like a second skin. She had once told him, when he surprised her with it on their 10th anniversary, that she'd never take it off. Not even in the shower, she'd laughed, holding out her wrist. It reminds me of everything we've been through. Daniel often pictured it lying somewhere in the woods, glinting under a shaft of light, waiting for someone to find it. Or still wrapped around her wrist, wherever she was, silent and unyielding. In the dark, the calendar turned again. A new year began. And though the posters grew worn and the headlines stopped, Daniel never gave up. He carried a folded photo of her in his jacket, right beside his heart. He hiked the trail every week, and with every step, he whispered her name, believing that somewhere in the great expanse of trees and time, Emily could still hear him. In the quiet that followed the fading search, Daniel's world shrank to the size of their empty home. It sat at the edge of town, a modest blue house with wide shutters and a porch swing that rarely moved anymore. Once filled with the soft rhythm of two lives intertwined, it now echoed with a silence that weighed heavier than grief itself. The room still held her presence, not in some spectral sense, but in the way her favorite cardigan still hung on the back of the dining chair, the way her collection of teacups lined the kitchen shelf untouched. The way her handwriting lived on sticky notes tucked into cookbooks and beside light switches. Every corner of the house was a reminder of what had been. Every breath he took in it hurt. Their marriage had never been flashy or filled with grand gestures. Emily and Daniel were the kind of couple who thrived in the quiet, who knew each other's thoughts with a glance, who could spend an entire Sunday in silence and never feel alone. They'd met in college in a literature class, bonded over dog-eared copies of Walt Whitman and Wendell Berry, and built a life from shared values and simple joys. They weathered storms together, a miscarriage that nearly broke them in year 3, Daniel's job loss in year 5, her mother's slow passing in year 7. Through it all, they held tight to each other, hands clasped even in the darkest moments. By their 10th anniversary, when he gave her the bracelet, she had whispered, "We made it through the fire. I don't need anything else." That bracelet, a slim silver chain with 3 charms, was more than jewelry. It was a story, the book for her love of teaching and writing, the leaf for her connection to nature, the heart for the life they had carved together. She wore it every day, even to bed. Daniel remembered watching her twist it around her wrist absent-mindedly while reading, or letting it catch the sunlight while she watered the garden. It had become part of her, like a quiet vow she wore on the outside. After she vanished, Daniel clung to that bracelet in his memory. It was one of the last things he saw on her. He pictured it constantly, imagined it on her wrist as she walked the trail, as she perhaps stumbled, or sat beneath a tree waiting for rescue. It haunted him. That small, shining piece of silver carried more weight than he could bear, because it was the last thread that tied her to the world. People told him to grieve, to mourn, to let go. But how could he when there was no certainty? A missing person occupies a strange place in the heart. They are neither gone nor here, and the mind loops endlessly through every possible explanation. Some days, Daniel believed she was alive. Somewhere hurt or perhaps with no memory. Other days, he thought she had fallen, and that her body lay somewhere just out of reach, waiting to be found. And on the worst days, days when the house felt like it was caving in on him, he wondered if she had chosen to leave, if there was some corner of her soul he had never truly known. He hated those thoughts, but they came unbidden, like shadows, stretching across the walls at dusk. He found himself replaying their final months together, searching for signs. Had she seemed distant, preoccupied? There had been moments-long silences, evenings when she went to bed early, mornings when she lingered too long in thought. But Emily had always been introspective. She was the kind of woman who needed solitude the way others needed conversation. She found clarity in long walks, in sketching wildflowers, in curling up with old novels. That was part of why he loved her. Doubt is a corrosive thing. It seeped into his routines, turned ordinary memories into questions. The last breakfast they'd shared, had she looked distracted? The note she left on the fridge, gone hiking, back before dinner. 3. Had the heart at the end been hurried? He searched for answers in their journals, hoping for clues, but found only pages of gentle musings, thoughts on birds, poems about silence, sketches of tree bark and clouds. There was no hint of running, only a woman seeking quiet who had wandered into the woods and never returned. Daniel couldn't sleep in their bed anymore. He moved to the couch, where the cushions didn't hold her scent. He stopped cooking. Meals became whatever he could microwave or order. On weekends, he drove the loop they used to take into the mountains, stopping at overlooks where she'd once leaned into him and pointed at deer. He sat in the car with the windows down, the breeze brushing against his face like a memory, and tried not to fall apart. Friends drifted. Some stayed in touch, dropping off casseroles or checking in by text, but most didn't know what to say anymore. Grief, especially the kind that lingers unresolved, makes people uncomfortable. They want closure, clean lines. But Daniel had none to offer. He stopped attending church. He didn't return calls. Even his sister, who once visited every week, began coming less. The silence grew thicker, the walls closer. Emily was everywhere and nowhere. One night, nearly 2 years after she vanished, Daniel stood in the backyard with her old watering can, pouring water onto the parched soil around her favorite roses. The stars above were sharp and countless. He remembered how she used to hum when she gardened, a melody from an old folk song her mother had taught her. He could almost hear it now, carried on the wind, and for a moment, he let himself believe she was near. That's when he made the decision. He would not give up, not until he had answers. Not until he found anything that told him what had happened. Whether she was out there waiting or already part of the forest she loved so dearly, he would find her. He owed her that. He owed their story that much. And so, with tired eyes and a heart stitched together by memory, he picked up his flashlight, opened the map he had marked 100 times, and planned his next return to the trail. As time marched forward and the world outside continued its indifferent spin, the mystery of Emily Lawson's disappearance settled like a fog over the town of Roanoke. It wasn't just the community that couldn't forget Emily had become part of the mountain story, the kind of tale whispered at campfires and shared over coffee at roadside diners. She wasn't just a missing person anymore. She was the woman who walked into the woods and vanished, a question mark at the end of an otherwise ordinary sentence. For Daniel, the mystery wasn't some story to speculate over. It was the very air he breathed. Every single day that passed without answers pulled at the threads of his sanity, slowly, persistently unraveling what was left of the life they'd shared. He had kept everything from those first weeks. The maps with highlighted search zones, printed satellite images, voicemail messages from volunteers, even the scrawled notes from old hikers who claimed to have seen something. They filled a drawer in the desk Emily once used, now a makeshift archive of heartbreak. Sometimes, late at night, he would open one of the notebooks she'd left behind and just trace the loops of her handwriting with his finger. He found comfort in the soft rhythm of her words. She wrote about the wind as if it were a character, about tree branches like they were arms reaching for the sky. There was no darkness in those pages, no signal of sorrow. Just a woman who loved the world deeply, who saw beauty in silence and meaning in the simplest of things. Daniel found himself slipping into a new routine. Mornings began with coffee he never finished and a walk around the block that served no purpose. Afternoons were often spent online, scanning forums and threads dedicated to missing persons. There, among strangers posting grainy maps and timelines, Emily's name appeared again and again. Internet sleuths speculated wildly, some respectful, others reckless. One man claimed she had staged her own disappearance and was living in Colorado. Another believed she'd been abducted by a survivalist living off-grid. Daniel read it all. He couldn't help himself. He knew most of it was noise, but buried somewhere in the chaos, there might be a truth that hadn't yet surfaced. He reached out to anyone who had hiked the Blue Ridge during the week she disappeared. He'd posted in hiking forums, offered rewards for any photograph that might show a figure in the background, a flicker of movement on a distant ridge. Dozens of people responded. He sorted through hundreds of images, landscapes, campsites, group selfies, but nothing ever stood out. The more he looked, the more the mountains seemed to taunt him, its trees bending in the same unyielding silence they had since that first cold night. On the anniversary of her disappearance each year, Daniel returned to the trail, not just to walk it, but to honor her. He brought one of her poems, read it aloud near the trailhead, and left behind a small stone painted with her initials. It became a ritual, one he refused to break, even when no one else joined him. There, Park rangers began to recognize him. Some would stop to talk. Others simply nodded, offering quiet solidarity. They didn't need to ask why he kept coming back. They already knew. At night, Daniel would lie awake listening to the sounds of the house and wonder if he should move. Friends suggested it might help. New walls, new scenery. But how could he leave the only place where her voice still seemed to echo? Her presence was stitched into the very bones of the house. The floorboards creaked differently where she used to walk. The wind chimes she'd made from seashells still tinkled outside the kitchen window. Moving would mean abandoning all of that. And he couldn't. Not yet. The years passed, marked by seasons that came and went with robotic precision. The world changed, stores closed, new ones opened, faces in town grew older, but Emily's mystery never did. Her posters faded, replaced by others. The sheriff's office eventually archived her file. The media stopped calling. The trail continued to lure hikers, none of whom knew that somewhere beneath their boots lay miles of pain and questions. Daniel walked among them, unnoticed, just another solitary figure on a well-worn path. He tried therapy once. A friend had insisted. The therapist was kind, a soft-voiced woman named Martha who had pictures of sunrises on her wall. But when she asked Daniel to speak of acceptance, something inside him recoiled. How do you accept a question with no answer? How do you bury a future that hasn't been proven lost? He never returned after the third session. It wasn't for him. The only place that made any sense was the mountain. The only voice he wanted to hear was the one that had been taken by the trees. There were dreams, too. Sometimes vivid, sometimes fleeting. In them, Emily appeared not as a ghost, but as herself, barefoot in the garden or standing by the trail's edge smiling. Once, she reached for him and whispered, "Not yet." He woke up trembling, heart racing, unsure if it was comfort or torment. Was it a message? Was it memory? Then, in the 7th year, a chill passed through the town one morning, not from the weather, but from the news. A teenage hiker named Lily had gone exploring a lesser-known path near Devil's Elbow, a craggy section of the Blue Ridge that had always been too treacherous for casual wanderers. While pausing to tie her shoelace near a cluster of rocks, something glinted beneath the moss. She brushed it aside and uncovered a bracelet tarnished, delicate, unmistakably silver. It bore 3 charms: a book, a leaf, a heart dot. Within hours, the story returned to every local station, every headline, every whisper. The bracelet had been confirmed by Daniel. After 7 long years, the mountain had finally spoken, not with words, but with a symbol. A thread had been pulled loose. The mystery that had lingered like smoke was stirring once more. Something was about to shift. It was a Sunday afternoon in early spring when the phone rang. Daniel was in the backyard, kneeling in the garden Emily once tended, coaxing new life from old soil. He rarely answered unknown numbers anymore. Too many years had passed, too many calls that led nowhere. But something about the persistence of this one, the way it rang and rang, as if demanding to be heard, made him wipe his hands on his jeans and pick it up. The voice on the other end belonged to a sheriff's deputy from Nelson County, young and steady. He said they had something Daniel might want to see. When Daniel asked what, the deputy hesitated for a beat, then said, "A bracelet. We think it might have belonged to your wife." Daniel stood in silence, the world around him going quiet. He didn't speak for a full 10 seconds, didn't breathe, didn't move. Then he whispered one word: "Where?" The story came out in fragments. A teenage girl named Lily Collins had been hiking with her parents just off the main loop near Devil's Elbow, a part of the mountain that had always been considered too steep and too dangerous for search teams to thoroughly comb in the early days. While climbing over a patch of loose rocks near an old pine tree, She'd noticed a glint of silver poking through the moss. Thinking it might be litter, she reached down and pulled free a thin chain, its clasp broken, its surface dulled by years exposed to the elements. But the charms were still there, 3 of them, a tiny book, a leaf, a heart dot the family reported to find to park authorities. It wasn't until a ranger with a sharp memory heard the description that they realized what it could mean. The ranger had been part of the original search for Emily 7 years earlier. He remembered Daniel's face, remembered the heartbreak etched into the lines that hadn't been there before. And he remembered the bracelet. It had been described in every missing persons bulletin, listed in the possessions she was last seen with. That bracelet had become a symbol of her story, and now, suddenly, it was no longer lost. Daniel drove to the sheriff's office that evening. The sky was pale with twilight, the air humming with early spring insects. He walked into the building, carrying a photo of Emily wearing the bracelet, the same photo he had folded and unfolded so many times over the years that the creases had nearly torn through her smile. A detective named Ruiz met him with quiet professionalism and led him into a room where the bracelet sat inside a sealed evidence bag on a plain metal table. The moment Daniel saw it, he didn't need confirmation. His knees nearly gave out. It was hers. He asked to hold it. The detective, after a pause, opened the bag and placed it gently in Daniel's hands. It was cold, its once polished surface now scratched and worn, but unmistakable. The charm still moved slightly when touched. Daniel turned it over in his palms, as if it were a living thing. "She wore this every day," he said softly. "Even to bed." Ruiz nodded and said the area where it was found would now be the center of a new investigation. A cold case team was being assembled. They would bring fresh eyes, new equipment, and, most importantly, renewed urgency. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the bracelet lying in front of him, lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. He couldn't stop staring at it. Holding it again was like touching a piece of her soul, a whisper from the past that cut through the long, endless silence. He thought of all the days he'd spent imagining her alone in the forest, clinging to hope, and wondered if this little chain had fallen as she reached for help, or if it had simply slipped loose during a moment of stillness. He didn't know. He only knew that it had found its way back. News spread quickly. By Monday morning, local media stations were running the story bracelet found believed to belong to missing woman Emily Lawson. Reporters gathered outside the sheriff's office. Online forums exploded with theories. Old volunteers from the original search reached out to Daniel, offering to help again. The case that had once gone cold was warm now, blazing with a new sense of purpose. And through it all, Daniel remained steady. He wasn't overwhelmed by hope this time. He had learned over the years how easily hope could betray you. But this was different. This was real. The bracelet's location gave the team something they'd never had before, a precise point. GPS coordinates were logged. The area was mapped in detail. For the first time in years, professional teams returned to the Blue Ridge Mountains with renewed determination. Drones flew over Devil's Elbow, capturing terrain previously unseen. Thermal imaging and LiDAR scanned beneath the tree canopy, revealing dips and breaks in the earth hidden to the human eye. Park rangers cleared access roads. Investigators donned gear and headed into the forest, not just to search, but to find Daniel. Was there the day the team began the new sweep. He didn't join them in the thick of the woods. Age and wear had slowed him, but he remained nearby, pacing along the edge of the tree line, listening to the rustling leaves and the calls of the searchers as they disappeared into the shadows. He felt something in the air, something he hadn't felt in years. Not exactly hope, not exactly dread, something in between. A tension, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and The team emerged from the forest with tired eyes and muddy boots. No new findings were reported. But no one was discouraged. This was only the beginning. The bracelet had opened a door, cracked a silence that had once felt permanent. For the first time in 7 long years, Emily's name wasn't just a memory. It was a question waiting to be answered. And now, finally, they were ready to listen. It began with a sound. Not loud, not startling, but steady and dull. Rhythmic thud as a team of investigators cleared brush on a slope just below Devil's Elbow, where the bracelet had been found. The forest there was old, dense, and coiled, with undergrowth, the kind of place daylight struggled to reach. The air was heavy with spring rain and the musky scent of pine needles. Everything about the spot seemed untouched, as though the trees themselves had been holding their breath for years. No official search team had ever fully explored this jagged section of the mountain. Too steep, too dangerous, too remote. But now, with the bracelet as a marker, the team pressed forward, determined to see what the woods had hidden all this time. It was mid-morning when the first discovery was made. A young ranger named Kyle, new to the department but meticulous in his work, was using a metal probe to test beneath a bed of leaves when he struck something hard. He paused, gently cleared away the debris, and uncovered a partially buried shoe. It was old, faded, and stiff with time, but unmistakably feminine. Within minutes, others gathered around him. They expanded the area, working slowly, methodically, clearing inch by inch until more items began to appear. A cracked water bottle, a torn strap from a day pack, fragments of faded fabric. And then something far more personal, a sketchbook, weathered but mostly intact, its cover etched with hand-drawn leaves. Daniel's breath caught in his throat when he was shown a photo of the book. He recognized it instantly. Emily's journal. The forest, long silent, was speaking at last. With the site now confirmed as a probable location where Emily had spent time, or possibly her final moments. The area was cordoned off, and a full-scale excavation began. Specialists were brought in. Forensics teams, anthropologists, and ground-penetrating radar units combed every inch. What had once been a forgotten patch of wilderness transformed into a scene of careful analysis and reverent discovery. No one rushed. Every twig was documented, every soil sample bagged. This wasn't just an investigation. It was an unveiling. Over the next 2 days, more items emerged. Pieces of clothing consistent with what Emily had been wearing. A torn page from her journal with a poem that read like a whisper to the trees. I sit beneath their watchful arms and wonder if they know the ache of being lost or the mercy in letting go. The words were faint, smeared by water, but unmistakably hers. There was also evidence that suggested she may have tried to build shelter, a frame of branches, partially collapsed, with scraps of fabric tied between them, a pair of socks rolled neatly, a rusted flashlight, long dead, but still, no remains. Daniel stood at the perimeter each day, speaking little, watching as the earth gave back what it had kept for so long. He didn't need to ask questions. He felt the answers blooming slowly around him, unspoken but undeniable. Emily had been here. The bracelet was only the beginning. She had made it to this place, had tried to survive. Maybe she had been injured. Maybe she had simply lost her way and couldn't find her path back. He imagined her, in those final days, huddled beneath the pines, clutching her journal, waiting. And somehow, even as sorrow took root deeper inside him, he felt a strange calm begin to grow. Not peace, not yet, but something close to understanding. The investigators continued their work. They mapped the entire section of forest, comparing it to search logs from 7 years prior. It became painfully clear how easily Emily had been missed. The terrain was brutal, sharp drops, blind corners thick with thorny vines. Had she slipped while descending? Had she chosen this spot for its concealment? No one could say for certain. The forest, even as it revealed, still kept its secrets. But then, on the third morning, a discovery stopped everyone cold just beyond. The shelter site, beneath a shallow rise blanketed in ferns, a small cavity was unearthed. Inside lay skeletal remains, curled slightly, as if the person had gone to sleep. Nearby, a fragment of fabric still clung to bone, a muted green pattern, matching a shirt Emily had often worn. The remains were fragile, worn by time, but intact enough for identification. And there, beside them, lay the final unmistakable sign. A rusted keyring with a single key. Daniel recognized it before he was even told. It belonged to their back door. She had taken it with her, as she always did, even for short hikes. The moment was still. Investigators bowed their heads. No one spoke. In that silence, the mountain gave its answer. After 7 years, Emily Lawson had finally been found. Daniel didn't cry when they told him. Not at first. He simply nodded, looked up at the sky filtering through the trees, and whispered, "Thank you." There was grief, yes, deep and sharp and long, but also a release. The not knowing had been the hardest part. Now, he could finally step beyond. That shadow, Emily hadn't left him. She hadn't disappeared into another life. She had been here, close all along, wrapped in the same forest she loved, the place that had called to her heart again and again. That evening, as the team began packing their gear, Daniel remained behind. He walked to the edge of the cleared site and stood there, listening. The forest was quiet but not empty. It was as if the trees themselves were exhaling. He closed his eyes and whispered her name once more, not as a plea this time, but as a benediction. Emily had been found. The forest had remembered. And at last, after years of silence, it had spoken her name. The days after Emily's remains were found moved with a solemn quiet, like the hush that follows the last note of a long, mournful song. In Roanoke, the news spread gently at first, a whisper between neighbors, then a wave that washed over the community in slow, stunned silence. For many, it reopened a chapter they had quietly tucked away. For Daniel, it was as if the pages had never been closed at all. Now, with the answer finally in hand, everything he had tried to hold back, every suppressed memory, every aching thought came rushing forward, unbidden, as vivid as if they'd happened yesterday. He spent that first morning alone, sitting on the edge of the porch where Emily used to sip her tea at sunrise. The bracelet she always wore rested on the wooden rail beside him, cleaned and placed in a small velvet pouch the forensics team had returned to him the night before. He hadn't let go of it since. It sat now like a relic of a life that felt both impossibly distant and painfully close. In his lap was one of her journals, a leather-bound book with petals pressed between the pages in ink that carried her soft, looping handwriting. Daniel didn't read the words aloud. He didn't have to. He remembered them. The memories arrived without warning. Her laughter in the garden, when she tried to plant tomatoes and ended up with wild mint instead. The way she tucked her feet. Under her on the couch, a blanket always draped over her legs, a novel balanced carefully in her hands. Her morning rituals: warm lemon water, 3 pages in her journal, a walk around the yard before breakfast. He remembered the way she danced barefoot in the living room when her favorite old songs came on the radio, her fingers twirling in the air as if conducting the very joy around her. And he remembered, with a kind of aching clarity, the night before she disappeared. They had made pasta together. She had kissed his cheek, tucked her head under his chin, and whispered, "I'm so glad it's you." That single sentence had lived with him through all the years of not knowing. It had kept him warm on cold nights and haunted him in the loneliest hours. And now, with the truth in hand, it returned with new weight. She hadn't left because she wanted to. She had walked into the woods because she trusted the quiet, believed in the safety of the trees. And when the forest failed her, it hadn't been malice. It had been indifference. Nature, in all its beauty, had turned away in silence. And she had met her end there, quietly, probably peacefully, folded into the very earth she had adored. The community began reaching out. Cards appeared in Daniel's mailbox. Flowers were left on the porch. Former students of Emily's sent long letters filled with memories of her kindness, her calm presence, the way she listened without judgment. One wrote, "She was the first adult who made me feel like my voice mattered." Another said, "When I lost my mom, Mrs. Lawson let me stay in her classroom during lunch. I never forgot that." He read every note, letting them wash over him like a tide of gentle grief. She had not vanished. Her impact had lingered in ways he had never fully known. Plans were made for a memorial. Nothing large. Emily had never cared for crowds. Instead, it would be a gathering at Flat Rock Hollow Trail, the place where her car had been found, where the search had first begun. The town secured a permit. Her sister flew in from Oregon. Friends and family offered to speak. And Daniel, though uncertain if he could find the words, agreed to try. In the days leading up to the service, he found himself returning to the spot where she'd been discovered. Not with a team, not with officials, just him, alone, as he had been for so many years. The forest had changed in places. Trees had fallen. Paths had shifted. But in the clearing where her shelter had once stood, the air felt the same, still, respectful. He knelt by the spot, brushing leaves away from the soft earth, and placed a small stone etched with her initials at the base of a pine. He stayed there for a long while, saying nothing, letting the wind do all the talking. That night, he found her old sketchpad buried in a box in the closet. Inside were dozens of drawings, some of trees, some of animals, but many of him. His profile as he read, his hands resting on the kitchen counter, his silhouette in the doorway. She had seen him, truly seen him, in all the ways that mattered. The last page was unfinished, a drawing of a cabin in the woods with smoke curling from the chimney, and in the margin she had written, "Someday." Daniel traced the image with trembling fingers, tears falling soundlessly. She had dreamed of building a retreat in the mountains, a place of quiet, a place where she could write and paint and breathe. He had once dismissed it as fantasy, something they'd do in retirement. Now, he saw it for what it was, a longing for permanence, for simplicity, for peace. A longing that had carried her into the trees one final time. The forest had taken her. But it had also held her, gently, all these years. And now, having given her back, it felt as though something sacred had shifted. The mystery was no longer a wound. It was a story. Not one he would ever forget, but one he could finally lay to. Rest. As the sun rose over the town of Roanoke, the morning of the memorial, the sky glowed with the same soft gold it had the day she disappeared. Daniel stood on the trail, the bracelet in his hand, and whispered into the wind, "Thank you for keeping her. Thank you for bringing her home." And for the first time in 7 years, the air felt light. The silence felt kind. And his heart, though broken, began to beat with the rhythm of memory, not pain. The morning of the memorial hike arrived, draped in a soft fog that curled around the Blue Ridge foothills like a shawl, quiet and reverent. Daniel stood at the edge of the trailhead at Flat Rock Hollow, just as the sun broke through the mist, in streaks of pale gold. He held the bracelet in his hand clean now, its silver charms glinting in the light. The book, the leaf, the heart. He had traced each one 100 times in the last few weeks, the weight of them familiar and grounding. Today, he would carry it with him one final time. Friends, family, and neighbors began to arrive in hushed groups, their footsteps soft on the damp earth. Some carried flowers, others warm thermoses, and many held photographs, Emily laughing. Beside Daniel, Emily in her classroom, Emily sitting cross-legged beneath a maple tree with a journal balanced on her knee. The gathering was not large, but it was full of meaning. There were old students, gray-haired colleagues from her teaching days, and hikers who had volunteered in the search years ago and had never quite let her go. A ranger stood nearby, nodding to Daniel with a look of quiet respect. They had arranged to keep the trail closed to the public that morning, allowing the group privacy as they made their way up the winding path. At exactly 8 o'clock, Daniel took the first step forward, the bracelet curled in his palm, and the others followed in silence. No one spoke. There was no need. The forest spoke for them. The trail was familiar to Daniel in a way few things were. Each bend held a memory. Each rise in the path carried the weight of his footsteps from 7 years of searching. But today, the trail felt different. Not haunted, not sorrowful, just still, reverent. The birdsong was soft and sparse, the wind moving through the trees with a kind of hush, as if even nature had paused to listen. As they climbed, Daniel remembered the last time he and Emily had walked this trail together. She had stopped to examine a cluster of mushrooms growing beneath a fallen log, her fingers gently brushing the caps as she described them in terms he'd never heard. "They look like fairy umbrellas," she had said, smiling. He remembered how she closed her eyes at overlooks, letting the wind press against her face like a blessing. How she called the trees her cathedral, and how she had said, not long before, her final hike, "If I could die anywhere, let it be here." He hadn't understood the weight of those words then. Now, they echoed through him like scripture. About an hour into the walk, the group reached the clearing near Devil's Elbow, the place where Emily's belongings had been found, where the earth had finally told its story. It had been gently cleared in the week since, the shelter's remains respectfully preserved, a small wooden bench placed nearby by volunteers. Someone had left a stack of river stones, each one painted with a word: love, peace, return, truth. Daniel stepped forward and knelt beside the pile. He placed the bracelet there with careful hands, tucking it between 2 stones. He didn't speak. His silence said everything. Then he rose, turned to face the group, and for the first time in a long while, he began to speak not as a grieving husband, but as a man who had finally come through the fog of not knowing. "She loved this place," he said, voice steady. Not because it was easy or safe, but because it reminded her that life was wide and wild and full of mystery. When she walked into these woods, she wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to connect. And though she never came home the way I'd hoped, I believe the mountain held her gently. And now she's part of it. There were tears, but they were quiet. Not wrenching sobs, not loud anguish, just the kind of tears that fall when something holy has passed through the heart. Emily's sister read a passage from one of her journals, her voice breaking but never faltering. A former student shared how Emily had taught her not just how to write, but how to listen to the world around her. Others laid flowers beneath the bench. Lavender, white roses, wild daisies from the roadside, as the sun rose higher. Light poured through the trees like stained glass. Daniel sat for a while after the others had begun the walk back down, watching the way the leaves shimmered in the breeze. He didn't feel alone. Not anymore. He felt held by the trees, by memory, by the quiet hum of love that had refused to vanish even when everything else had. On the descent, someone began to hum softly. An old folk tune. The same one Emily used to hum while watering the garden. The sound moved through the group like a thread, stitching them together as they moved down the path, not as mourners, but as witnesses to a story that had come full circle. That night, Daniel returned home to the quiet blue house with white shutters. He brewed a cup of tea, poured it into one of Emily's favorite cups, and set it on the windowsill. Just once more. just in case. Then he sat on the porch with a blanket over his legs, the evening breeze moving through the wind chimes she had made from seashells. The sound was soft, like laughter drifting in from another time. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I found you." Not to the wind, not to the woods, but to her, to the part of her that still lived in every corner of his heart. And in that moment, he felt not grief, but something else. Something close to peace. Something like home. The week after the memorial passed slowly, the air thick with the kind of stillness that follows a long-awaited goodbye. But Daniel found that grief had shifted its shape. It was no longer a storm crashing against the walls of his days, but something softer, quieter, a tide that came and went, leaving behind traces of memory like sea foam on the shore. He moved through the house not with dread, but with something closer to reverence. Everywhere he looked, she was there. And yet, for the first time in years, the sight of her handwriting on a sticky note or the scent of lavender on a scarf didn't hollow him out. Instead, it filled him. In the days following the hike, he began the delicate process of sorting through the boxes he had left untouched for so long. They were all stacked neatly in the attic, each one labeled in Emily's precise penmanship: summer journals, old sketches, trail maps. He hadn't been ready to open them before. But now, with her story finally given its ending, he felt strong enough to touch the pages of her life again. He opened the first box and found a notebook, its spine worn from use. Inside were passages of her thoughts during her hikes, meditations. On the smell of wet leaves, the silence between birdsong, the way light moved through the trees like liquid gold. One entry, dated a week before she vanished, read, "There's something comforting in being small beneath the sky. I don't want to conquer the world. I want to feel it breathing." Daniel closed his eyes, letting those words bloom in his chest. She had always been that way, gentle, observant, more interested in the heartbeat of the world than its noise. In another box, he found a bundle of letters she had never mailed. Some were addressed to him, others to friends or her sister. One was labeled simply, "To be read someday." With trembling hands, he opened it. The letter was short, written in her usual clean, looping script. "If you're reading this," it began, "it means life surprised us in some way. I hope it's not because something bad has happened, but if it is, I want you to know that I went into the forest because I loved it, not because I was running from anything. If I don't come back, don't let the not knowing eat you alive. Let the trees hold you like they held me. And remember, love doesn't vanish. It waits." He reread those words over and over, tears streaming down his face, not from sorrow, but from the kind of relief that only comes when someone you've lost finds a way to speak again. It was as if she'd left a candle burning in the dark, just for a small flame to follow back to himself. Over the next several days, Daniel continued uncovering fragments of her doodles in the margins of old trail guides. Grocery lists that somehow still made him smile. A half-finished story tucked between the pages of a gardening book. It was a fairy tale about a woman who turned into a tree and whispered her secrets through the wind. The story ended mid-sentence, but it didn't need a final line. It said enough, but what struck him most wasn't the items themselves. It was the feeling that Emily had somehow prepared him for this. Her presence in those boxes wasn't a haunting. It was a hand on his shoulder, a reminder that even in absence, she remained. That she had always known how to live with intention, how to leave behind pieces of herself that would carry forward. Not just for him, but for anyone who had ever known her. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace with her journals stacked beside him, Daniel found a flash drive taped to the inside cover of one. Plugging it into his laptop, he discovered a folder titled, "For Later." Inside were recordings, audio files of Emily reading her own poems, describing her favorite hikes, laughing as she told short stories into the microphone. Her voice filled the room like sunlight through a cracked window. He sat there for hours, eyes closed, just listening. It was the sound of her breathing life into silence, a final gift she hadn't known he'd need. That night, he couldn't sleep. But instead of pacing the house or reaching for old photos, he stepped out onto the porch with a blanket and looked up at the stars. It was clear and cold, the air smelling faintly of pine. Somewhere in the branches, an owl hooted once, then fell silent. Daniel pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and whispered into the night. You knew. You always knew how to leave the world better than you found it. He began writing again, something he hadn't done since she disappeared. Not long, sweeping entries, but short reflections. Moments, bits of dialogue they once shared. The way she used to pause before answering a question, as if tasting her thoughts before speaking. He didn't write to make sense of the past. He wrote to remember that it had been real. That love, once lived, doesn't evaporate. It lingers. It roots deep and in the smallest of things, in the crinkle of a well-read page, the press of her pen. On a journal, the faint lavender scent of a scarf left draped over a chair Emily remained, not as a shadow, but as a presence. She had left behind more than memory. She had left behind meaning. And now, with every step Daniel took forward, he carried that with him not as a weight, but as a light. The days that followed settled into something quieter, deeper than peace, something like acceptance, but with a tender ache that never fully left. It wasn't the kind of closure Daniel had once imagined, when every sleepless night was fueled by desperate questions and unbearable not knowing. That version of closure had seemed like a door slamming shut. This was different. This was a window opening, letting in the breeze of what remained. Emily's return to him hadn't come with fanfare or finality. It had arrived softly, like her voice used to, reminding him that some endings are really beginnings in disguise. He started waking earlier, not out of obligation, but out of want. He made coffee the way she used to like it, half a teaspoon of cinnamon stirred in with the grounds, and carried it out to the porch, where the sun now rose behind the same trees she had once painted in watercolors. The sketchbook still sat on the table beside him, its pages curling slightly at the corners. He turned to a blank sheet and wrote a single word across the top: continuance. He didn't know exactly what he meant by it yet, only that something was asking to keep going. In the afternoons, he visited the small memorial at Devil's Elbow. The park had placed a wooden marker just off the trail with her name carved into it, along with a short inscription chosen from her own journal. Let the forest remember me kindly. The first time he saw the plaque, he stood before it for almost an hour, just listening to the wind through the trees. And each time he returned, the space felt more sacred, more like hers, and oddly, more like his too. People kept reaching out. A local reporter asked to interview him for a feature about Emily's life and the mystery that had finally found its answer. He agreed, but only on the condition that the piece not focus on her disappearance, but her presence, who she had been, how she had lived, what she had loved. The article ran with the title, She Listened to the Trees, The Life of Emily Lawson, and it struck a chord. Letters poured in from people who had never met her, but felt as if they had. Some shared their own stories of loss, others wrote of how they had begun walking trails again or journaling again because of her. Her name, once a headline about tragedy, had become a quiet anthem of grace. At night, Daniel started recording his thoughts. Not just journaling, but speaking aloud. Sometimes into the recorder she'd used. It felt strange at first, talking to no one, but as the days passed, he realized he wasn't talking into emptiness. He was speaking into continuity, into the space Emily had left behind. Her memory didn't need monuments or ceremony. It needed voice, breath, living rhythm. One evening, While organizing a few old files on her laptop, he found a folder he'd missed before. Titled Retreat Plans, it held outlines and designs for a mountain riding cabin she had once dreamed of building. She had even named it Still Point, a place for silence, reflection, and creativity. It was modest, a single room with a porch, a desk, a bed, and large windows facing east. She had drawn sketches, written lists of materials, and bookmarked designs for sustainable, eco-friendly construction. At the end of the file, she had written, "Maybe one day, maybe someone else will finish what I begin." The next morning, Daniel called her sister, then a friend who worked in construction, then the ranger at the park. Within a week, he had permission to begin building a small, rustic retreat on a private edge of the parkland. Just beyond the clearing near Devil's Elbow, the cabin would be simple, respectful of the land, and open to riders, hikers, and anyone who needed stillness. He used her sketches exactly as they were. Every beam, every nail, every window, placed with her vision in mind. It took a full season to finish. But when he stood in the doorway on the final day of construction, he could almost hear her laughing behind him, whispering, "It's beautiful." They held a small dedication. Only a dozen people came, a mixture of family, friends, and those whose lives had quietly been changed by her words. They left handwritten notes inside a journal placed on the cabin's desk, the first entry written by Daniel himself. "To whoever finds this space, let it hold you the way she held the world, gently and with wonder." In the weeks that followed, the cabin began to draw visitors. Not many, just enough. Some came to write, others to sit in silence. A few had no reason at all. They simply felt drawn to it. Daniel returned often, sometimes alone, sometimes with someone who had known her, and each time he felt something blooming where grief had once grown wild. Not closure, not quite, but a sense of motion, of time continuing in the only way it truly can, with love shaping what remains. He still talked to her. In the garden, on the porch, in the clearing by the bench where her bracelet lay between the painted stones. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, when the wind rustled the trees just right or the chimes on the porch sang a note too perfect to be random, he felt her answer. There were still hard days. Days when the house felt too quiet or when her absence caught him off guard, like walking into a room and forgetting what you came for. But those moments passed more gently now. They didn't knock him over. They walked beside him. Closure hadn't been a door closing at all. It had been a hand reaching through, offering a thread, a way forward, a way to remember and remain. Emily had given him that. And in her absence, she had left a map not to bring him back to what was, but to guide him into what could be. And Daniel, with the slow, steady grace of a man who has known deep love and deep loss, kept walking. The mountain didn't look any different that day, though Daniel had imagined it might. He had come alone this time, early in the morning, when the mist still hugged the treetops and the only sounds were the rhythmic chirps of waking birds and the rustle of deer in the underbrush. The trail up to Devil's Elbow was slick with dew, the stones glistening, the earth fragrant and soft. His boots knew the path by heart now. Each step felt both familiar and sacred. He had walked it in grief. He had walked it in search. And now he walked it in something else, entirely not joy, exactly, but something solid and enduring. Something that felt like home. The cabin's Still Point stood nestled among the trees, just beyond the old clearing, its wooden frame worn in now, seasoned by wind and sun. The first light of morning touched its windows and spilled across the porch, where a chair waited, angled perfectly to catch the sunrise. Daniel sat there for a while without moving, the cool air brushing against his skin, the warmth of the rising sun slowly stretching across his shoulders. He had brought coffee in a thermos, the same way Emily used to pack it for their weekend hikes, and he poured it now into the old tin mug she had once used for painting watercolors. It was chipped at the rim, but he never thought to replace it. Some things held their place in the world, not because they were perfect, but because they had been touched by love. He took a sip and opened the journal on the desk beside him. The entries had filled up quickly over the past few months' poems, thoughts, reflections left behind by visitors who had come and gone, each one adding a new thread to the quiet tapestry Emily had begun. Some were just a few lines, written in shaky or hurried hands. Others were long, unfolding like stories meant for no one but the trees. A child had drawn a picture of a deer. A woman had written a prayer for her lost sister. A man had copied a haiku about the wind. And woven through it all, again and again, was gratitude for silence, for stillness, for the strange grace of being allowed to pause. Daniel added his own entry at the bottom of a fresh page. "You gave us this," he wrote. "This place to breathe, this trail to remember, this peace to walk toward." He paused for a moment, staring at the words, then added, "And it goes on. Because of you, it goes on." Later that afternoon, he took the path past the clearing to the small grove where her bracelet still lay, protected now by a simple glass casing and surrounded by stones that had been painted, rearranged, and added to by visitors over time. He crouched beside it and rested his hand on the earth. It was warm from the sun. He could smell pine needles, damp moss, and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle carried in the wind. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened, not for voices, not for signs, just for the way the forest breathed. And in that breath, he felt her again. Not a ghost, not a memory. Something more alive than that. The imprint of her footsteps still echoing on the trail. The hush of her smile in the leaves. The quiet persistence of her love in the roots of every tree. He stayed until the shadows stretched long across the ground, until the air grew cool and the colors of the forest turned to amber and deep green. Then he stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked back toward the cabin, the wind behind him, gentle and steady. That night, in his home, Daniel unpacked a small bundle of photographs he'd been meaning to sort. Pictures of hikes along, past, holidays, quiet days in the garden. One image caught his eye, a photo Emily had taken of their feet, side by side on a trail, dirt-dusted and tired after a long day's hike. In the background, the path curved out of frame, disappearing into trees. Daniel smiled and placed the photo on the mantel, propping it up against an old ceramic owl she had once found at a yard sale. He didn't need to see her face to feel her presence in the picture. It was in the angle, the intention, the captured ease of that moment. The trail, he realized, didn't end with her. It stretched beyond both of them into the lives of others, who now walked it, into stories not yet told, into afternoons still waiting in the light. Grief had not vanished. It had simply changed its shape. And love, true love, had become the map dot in the months that followed. Daniel began leading quiet walks for others who had known loss. No speeches, no counseling, just a gentle walk along. The same trail, with time to breathe, to listen, and to remember. People came sometimes just one, sometimes a handful. He never asked their stories. He didn't have to. They were written in the slow steps, the silence, the tears that came, unbidden and left without shame. The forest welcomed them all as it had once welcomed her. And so the trail went on. It went on in every quiet breath, in every footstep pressed into soft soil, in every name whispered beneath the canopy of trees. It went on in the stillness of a cabin lit by morning light, in journals left open on the desk, in voices carried by wind across the ridges. It went on in him and the man who had once walked it searching for an answer, and now walked it carrying her memory not as a burden, but as a guide. And somewhere in that rhythm, in the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the hush of morning, was her voice, no longer lost, no longer waiting, Just part of the trail. Just part of the world. Forever. Asterisk. And so, Emily's story reminds us that even in the deepest silence, love leaves a trail we can follow. Through loss, through waiting, through memory, and through hope, her journey became more than a mystery. It became a quiet testament to how life, even in the smallest details, can echo forever in the hearts of those who remember. Sometimes, the ones we lose find their way back to us not with answers, but with meaning, and in that, there is peace. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening to this story. If it touched you in any way, we would be truly grateful if you could like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, whether it's how the story made you feel, or maybe even a memory or experience from your own life that you'd like to share. Your stories matter, and your voice might just be the one someone else needs to hear today. Until next time, take care of yourself, treasure the ones you love, and never underestimate the power of a quiet moment. We'll see you in the next story.